Imagine medieval England, with imposing castles, lush green fields, and a seemingly endless struggle for the throne. On a cold night in 1452, at Fotheringay Castle, a baby was born. His name was Richard, and he was poised to become one of the most controversial figures in English history. His birth marked the beginning of a journey marked by intrigue, battles, and a destiny shaped by ambition. But who could have imagined that this baby, the son of a duke and grandson of a monarch, would become the last king of the Plantagenet dynasty, fighting for the crown in the midst of an England at war? Now, before we dive headfirst into this story full of twists and turns and mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on your thoughts. The story of Richard III is just beginning, and you won't want to miss a single chapter of this historical adventure. Richard was born on October 2, 1452, at a tense time for England. His father, Richard, Duke of York, was embroiled in disputes over the crown, as his family, the House of York, believed they had a right to the throne, rivaling the House of Lancaster. Richard was the Duke's fourth son, but it was clear from an early age that his life would be marked by the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, the bloody conflict between these two houses that lasted decades and profoundly shaped England's future. When Richard was still just a boy, his father was already deeply involved in the challenges to the crown. The Wars of the Roses were not just a military struggle, but a contest for legitimacy. For many, the right to the throne was tied to whoever had the best royal blood, and the House of York, with its direct descent from Edward III, claimed that right with force. This placed Richard and his family at the center of English politics, and his childhood was marked by this relentless struggle for power. At the age of 10, Richard faced the loss of his father, who was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, an event that deeply affected the young prince. As if losing his father were not enough, his death left Richard's family in an even more vulnerable position. His older brothers, Edward I and George, Duke of Clarence, would be central figures in the struggle for the crown, but the burden of protecting the House of York fell squarely on Richard's shoulders. After his father's death, Richard and his brothers became key figures in the struggle for the crown, and it was in this environment of constant danger that Richard gained his first taste of political intrigue. The court, dominated by the rivalry between the Yorks and the Lancastrians, was far from a safe place for young princes. However, Richard stood his ground and began to earn the respect of his allies. He quickly became embroiled in battle, not only to defend his family's right, but also to protect what remained of his royal line. Richard had to grow up quickly and learn the hard lessons of a kingdom at war. His father's death and the constant challenges for the crown forged his character and abilities. He would become a man and a leader who, despite his youth, would prove capable of facing adversities that his elders would fear. With his brother Edward I assuming the throne in 1461, Richard finally had a chance to prove his worth. But peace was a distant prospect, and the struggle for power continued. Richard, who was once just Edward I's brother, quickly saw the course of his life change drastically and unpredictably. The death of his older brother, King Edward I, in 1483, and the political complications that followed, created a window of opportunity for him to assume a power that until then seemed out of his reach. But how did he achieve this? And what happened to young Edward I, his nephew, who was supposed to be the next king? As we've seen, Richard was deeply embedded in the complex dynamics of the House of York, and Edward I's death didn't make things any easier. Edward I left behind a son, Edward III, who was only 12 years old and therefore incapable of ruling independently. As was common in monarchies of the time, someone would need to assume the regency until the young prince reached adulthood. But here's where Richard's story takes a significant turn. Instead of simply accepting the role of regent, as expected, Richard, then Duke of Gloucester, made a bold decision. He claimed the throne for himself. How did he do it? First, he claimed that Edward I's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, mother of the young Edward I, had been invalid, which in theory invalidated Edward I's son's claim to the throne. Richard asserted that, as the deceased king's brother, he had a more legitimate claim to the crown. This not only caused enormous turmoil at court, but also created a major division among England's nobles. While the House of Woodville, with its powerful matriarch Elizabeth, attempted to secure her son's position, Richard was able to capitalize on the fragile situation and proclaim himself king. But to ensure no one doubted his decision, Richard acted quickly. removing anyone who might pose a threat to his rule. The situation soon became even more complicated when young Edward Warth and his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were taken to the Tower of London. Officially, the boys were to be kept safe there until a formal resolution of the succession issue. However, the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the two princes have become one of the greatest mysteries in English history. Many believe that Richard had the boys killed, but to this day, there is no definitive proof. In any case, the prince's disappearance gave Richard the opportunity to assert his authority unopposed, and he was crowned Richard III. Now, with the crown firmly on his head, Richard III had to secure his position, not only among the nobility, but also among the people. Richard's accession to the throne was a direct blow to the adversaries of the House of York, but the manner in which he came to power, with the disappearance of the princes, tarnished his image and raised serious doubts about his legitimacy. His reign was beginning, but he knew the struggle for the throne was not over. And so Richard III's quest for stability became a constant battle, not only against internal rivals, but also against history and public perception. As the months and years passed, the pressure on the young king increased. But what would Richard's next move be? How would he confront the external enemies watching him? And most importantly, how would he deal with the growing opposition within his own country? After his accession to the throne, Richard III's image continued to be marked by a great mystery that never left his history alone. The disappearance of his nephews, Princes Edward I and Richard of Shrewsbury, in the Tower of London became one of the greatest enigmas in English history. What really happened to the two young princes? Why did they disappear so suddenly? And what role did Richard III play in this drama? The princes had been placed in the Tower of London shortly after Richard's accession to the throne. This was, in fact, common practice for prisoners and heirs to the throne, who for some reason needed to be protected. However, the princes' absence from public functions and their lack of appearances in historical records fueled rumors and speculation. Although they were officially protected and awaiting their coronation, signs soon became clear that they were mysteriously disappearing. The most widely accepted and debated version to this day is that Richard III had the two boys killed to eliminate any threat to his coronation. This is because, as we have seen, the dispute for the throne was not only a matter of military strength, but also of legitimacy. Edward V, although still young, had a legitimate claim to the throne, making him a direct threat to Richard's reign. The idea that the princes were killed was not just a court rumor, but spread widely throughout England, and was recorded by historians of the time, such as Thomas More, who later helped cement Richard III's status as a historical villain. Over the years, the question of the children's fate and Richard's responsibility became a central theme of his legacy. Although there was never concrete proof that he ordered the princes' deaths, speculation continued to grow. In the 19th century, during excavations at the Tower of London, the human remains of two boys were found, further deepening the mystery surrounding the true cause of death of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury. However, modern DNA testing has not definitively confirmed that the bones found actually belonged to the princes, and this question about what really happened to the children continued to haunt Richard III's image. During the reign of his dynasty, he was known as a king who made ruthless decisions to ensure his political security. But the disappearance of the princes made his image even darker. The idea that he was capable of killing his own relatives to preserve the throne became one of the strongest narratives against him, one that persists to this day. Furthermore, this mystery was amplified by authors and chroniclers who opposed Richard's reign. Like Shakespeare's Richard III, which portrays the king as a cruel and manipulative monster, the idea that he was responsible for the princes' deaths was perpetuated. The image of Richard III as a black-hearted king was solidified, and he began to be portrayed as a tyrant whose actions knew no bounds, including the murder of his own family members to secure his power. This mystery of the children in the tower became a landmark in history, one that continues to spark debate among historians to this day. And although the evidence has never been definitive, the shadow of Richard III over the disappearance of the princes has never disappeared. Each new generation continues to ask, what really happened? Was Richard III a monster or a politician who made ruthless decisions to preserve the throne in a time of constant threat? And so, with this great mystery hanging over his head, Richard continued his reign, but never able to shake the doubt that clung to his figure. But what would come next? How would he deal with the looming external and internal threats? that would jeopardize the very fate of the House of York. The moment had arrived when Richard III's fate would be decided on the battlefield, a confrontation that would change the course of English history forever. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22, 1485, was the culmination of the struggle for the English throne between Richard III and Henry Tudor, who would later become Henry VII. But how did we arrive at this decisive moment? What was at stake in this battle, and how would it affect the future of the nation? Richard III, with the crown firmly on his head, knew his reign was far from secure. Despite his skill in handling the kingdom's internal affairs, he still faced formidable external enemies. Henry Tudor, a distant member of the House of Lancaster, had amassed a significant army of rebels, disaffected nobles, and even French exiles who supported his claim to the throne. Henry enjoyed growing support from the English nobility, especially after widespread suspicions that Richard might be responsible for the deaths of his nephews, the princes in the Tower. The coming battle would be a struggle not just for military control, but for legitimacy and survival. For Richard, losing would mean the downfall of his dynasty, the end of his dream of consolidating the House of York's power. For Henry Tudor, victory would mark the rise of a new dynasty, the Tudor House, which would have a lasting impact on England for over a century. The Battle of Bosworth Field was not just a battle between two men, but the culmination of a decades-long struggle for the English throne. Bosworth Field in Leicestershire became a bloody scene of confrontation, where the armies of Richard and Henry clashed in a battle that seemed decided by a stroke of luck. Richard III led his troops courageously, flying the standard of the House of York, and the battle seemed evenly balanced at first. However, what followed was a dramatic turnaround. Treachery within Richard's own army was one of the factors that decided the outcome of the battle. William Stanley, one of the commanders originally loyal to Richard III, switched sides and allied himself with Henry Tudor in the midst of the battle. This moment of betrayal was decisive in Henry's victory, as he managed to surround Richard and his men. Richard III, despite being outnumbered, fought bravely until the last moment. However, at the end of the day, he was mortally wounded. Richard III's death was dramatic, as he was struck by a lance while fighting bravely, trying to escape the battle. The king's death was a fatal blow to the House of York and marked the end of its dynasty. With Henry Tudor's victory, the House of Lancaster assumed the throne of England. Henry was crowned Henry VII, beginning the Tudor dynasty, which would rule England for over 100 years. But Henry VII's accession also signaled the end of Richard III's reign and the end of the House of York. Richard's body was found on the battlefield, and his death symbolically marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new dynasty that would change the course of English history, including events such as the reign of Henry VIII and the English Reformation. The Battle of Bosworth Field was not only a military defeat for Richard III, but also a political and symbolic one. With his death, England underwent a transition of power, and many of the unresolved questions, such as Richard's legitimacy and the mysteries of his accession to the throne, became part of history. This battle also paved the way for the unification of the houses of Lancaster and York through the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, ushering in a new era of stability for the English monarchy. Henry VII, though victorious, was never certain of his position as king, as his accession was marked by contestation. But by killing Richard and securing the throne, he paved the way for a new dynasty and new hopes for England. Yet even with Henry VII's victory and the end of the war, Richard III's name never disappeared. The image of the last Yorkist king would continue to be debated for centuries, with the question of his legitimacy and his complex character remaining one of the greatest debates in English history. Richard III's fate became an enigma, a story of power, ambition, and tragedy that would echo through the centuries. And so, the fall of Richard III and the rise of Henry VII mark the end of an era and the birth of a new one. But Richard's story, his victories and defeats, his mysteries, and the intrigues surrounding him continue to fascinate. And that is why Richard III's legacy lives on, a historical figure who, though defeated on the battlefield, will never be forgotten. After Richard III's defeat at the Battle of Bosworth Field and his death, his name became widely associated with the image of a cruel and tyrannical monarch. His rise to power, marked by conspiracies and the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower, helped cement this negative image. But was Richard truly the monster history has made him out to be? Let's take a closer look at his portrayal and how his reputation evolved over the centuries. The image of Richard III as a tyrant began to be forged in the first years after his death. The main person responsible for this was Thomas More, a prominent 16th century historian and politician, who in his work The History of Richard III described the king in an extremely negative light. More portrayed him as a monstrous person with a physical deformity that represented his moral deformity. This description of Richard as a man with a crooked neck and a hump was widely accepted by many historians over the centuries. And of course, the allegation that he had killed his nephews, the princes, to secure his rule helped reinforce the image of a ruthless and unscrupulous monarch. This portrayal of Richard III as a villain was further amplified by William Shakespeare, who wrote the famous play Richard III, in which the king is portrayed as a Machiavellian and cruel being, willing to kill anyone who stands in his way. In the play, Richard is one of history's greatest villains, a man with a deformed physical appearance who also possesses a treacherous and power-hungry personality. The play was written during the reign of Henry VIII, and Shakespeare's intention was certainly to strengthen the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty, showing that Henry VII's victory over Richard III was a just victory after the tyranny of the last Yorkist king. Over the centuries, this image of Richard as a tyrant has become deeply ingrained in popular culture and in English history. During the Victorian era, for example, many works of art and literature continued to reinforce this idea of a cruel and monstrous Richard. Even after the discovery of his body in 2012, which shed new light on his figure, the image of Richard III as a monster still persists in many circles. However, in more recent times, modern historians have begun to revise their views of Richard III. The discovery of his remains and the analysis of his history have brought to light a new, more balanced approach. Many scholars now suggest that Richard, although he took drastic political measures to secure his position, may not have been as cruel as the traditional narrative suggests. He was, in fact, seen as a monarch who, throughout his reign, sought to implement legal reforms and administrative improvements, attempting to establish greater justice in the kingdom. Richard III, for example, implemented important legal changes during his short reign, such as the Inheritance Act of 1484, which aimed to protect the rights of widows and orphans, and a fairer system of appeals. He also took steps to curb abuses of power by nobles, a move that gained him support from some factions within the nobility. He strove to demonstrate that the crown could be a defender of the people, an image that was tarnished by the way his accession to the throne was perceived. Even with these attempts to modernize the system, the manner of his rise to power, especially the allegation that he had murdered the princes in the Tower, still weighed heavily on his reputation. And of course, his defeat at the Battle of Bosworth was the final straw in his history. Henry VII, the victor, quickly began writing his own version of events, reinforcing the idea that Richard was an illegitimate and cruel monarch, something that served to strengthen his own claim to the throne and the Tudor dynasty. The figure of Richard III, therefore, remains one of the most controversial and debated in English history. He is remembered both as a determined king who tried to govern with more just laws, and as a ruthless monarch, willing to do anything to maintain power, even eliminating members of his own family. This debate over his personality and actions reflects the complexity of his life and reign, and shows how history can be written in very different ways depending on the perspective of the teller. But what will be Richard III's true legacy? Was he a wronged king, the victim of a narrative that condemned him to posterity as a monster? Or was he truly the villain of the story, his actions reflecting a relentless pursuit of power? The story will continue to be debated, but the discovery of his body in 2012 ushered in a new era of understanding about this king and his trajectory. After Richard III's death in 1485 and Henry VII's triumph, many expected his name to be quickly erased from English history, replaced by the rise of the Tudor dynasty. But contrary to what many expected, Richard III's legacy was not so easily forgotten. His complex figure, marked by mystery and controversy, remained a point of debate for centuries, and to this day, he is remembered as one of England's most enigmatic kings. The first major revision of Richard's legacy began shortly after his death, when Henry VII, the new King of England, rushed to establish his own historical narrative. To reinforce the legitimacy of his dynasty, he and his political allies sought to construct an image of Richard III as a ruthless and illegitimate monarch. Henry VII's distant descendant from the House of Lancaster did not help cement his authority, so it was necessary to discredit Richard, the last monarch of the House of York. The propagation of a negative image of Richard was facilitated by chroniclers and historians of the time. Thomas More, one of the most influential figures of the English Renaissance, wrote a history of Richard III that portrayed him as a man of monstrous nature, not only physically but also morally. In his account, More described Richard as a man with physical deformities, a hunchback, and a shoulder blade larger on one side than the other, which he argued reflected the monarch's inner corruption. This depiction of Richard as a psychological and physical monster became one of the most popular narratives about him, giving him a villainous image that endured for centuries. But Shakespeare himself, in his famous play Richard III, further solidified this image. In the play, Richard is portrayed as a cruel, manipulative, and unscrupulous character, willing to commit murder and intrigue to achieve power. The famous line, "I am determined to be king, and I will be," reflects the figure of a man who, despite all adversity and obstacles, decides that ambition is his only path. Shakespeare, writing during the reign of Henry VIII, was part of the tradition of affirming the victory of the Tudor house and portraying Richard as the villain of the story, a natural obstacle to the rise of a new era of stability. Over time, the image of Richard III as a tyrant was cemented in history, but despite all this negative narrative, there was, in fact, another side to Richard's story that began to be re-evaluated, especially in the 20th century. In the late 19th century, and throughout the 20th century, the view of Richard III began to be reconsidered. Historically, scholars began to examine the evidence more impartially, unbiased by a narrative written by his political enemies. The discovery of his body in 2012, buried under a parking lot in Leicester, was a significant turning point. The reassessment of his figure, now more human and less monstrous, led to a new understanding of his legacy. Analysis of Richard's skeleton revealed that he suffered from scoliosis, but this was not as extreme a deformity as the hunchback described by More and Shakespeare. Although he had a curvature of the spine, it did not impede his physical fitness and did not justify the villainy attributed to him during his life and after his death. As a result, many historians began to question whether the image of Richard III as a monster was a political invention, yet another attempt to delegitimize his accession to the throne and justify Henry VII's victory. Furthermore, some scholars and defenders of his image have come to view Richard III as a king who attempted to implement important legal reforms, including more advanced legislation for widows and orphans, as well as establishing a more organized system for due process. His concern for ensuring justice and his efforts to reduce abuses by the nobility were aspects that began to gain prominence in the assessment of his reign, even though it was relatively short. Although his death marked the end of the York dynasty, Richard III's impact on history has not been erased. He became a tragic figure, a monarch who struggled against intense adversity and attempted, within his own limitations and ambitions, to reconfigure the English monarchy. Richard's story was transformed from a tale of a ruthless villain to a more complex narrative of a man forged by a time of intense divisions and power struggles. Ultimately, Richard III left an indelible mark on English history, not only through his reign and death, but also through the way he continued to fascinate later generations. His figure, shrouded in mystery, violence, and ambition, resonated both as a warning and as a reflection of the complexities of power and politics. After Richard III's death in 1485 and Henry VII's accession to the throne, Richard's story was not forgotten. On the contrary, his figure remained vivid in English culture, albeit in a deeply ambiguous way. However, over time, especially in the 20th century, many began to question the traditional narrative that labeled him exclusively as a ruthless tyrant. The discovery of his body in 2012, buried beneath a parking lot in Leicester, and new advances in historical research have helped shed new light on his legacy. Richard III began to be seen differently. The re-evaluation of his status as a monarch began to question the stigmas that had been cast upon him by writers like Shakespeare, as well as by the enemies of the House of York, who saw his accession to the throne as illegitimate and his nature as cruel and monstrous. The traditional image of Richard, built over centuries, was challenged by a new analysis, more focused on evidence and facts. The rediscovery of Richard III's body was a significant milestone. The skeleton revealed a man in reasonably good health for his time, but with a clear case of scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, which, contrary to Shakespeare's famous description of a monstrous hunchback, was a treatable condition that did not prevent him from being physically active. This discovery led many historians to re-evaluate Richard's figure, offering a more empathetic perspective on a man often portrayed in an overly negative light. But the impact of this discovery went beyond Richard's physical analysis. It also brought to light the complexities of his politics and governance. Many began to realize that, although Richard's reign was short and fraught with controversy, he did achieve some significant things. For example, he implemented legal reforms that helped improve justice in England, such as introducing more equitable legal processes and protecting the rights of widows and orphans. These steps suggest that Richard was interested in more just government, something not widely recognized in his time or by later historians. Another aspect that emerged from the new historical analysis is that, contrary to the portrayal of a tyrant, Richard appeared, at least initially, to be a pragmatic leader trying to stabilize a fragmented and warring kingdom. He took steps to resolve internal conflicts and restore order during a tumultuous period in English history. This view of Richard as a pragmatic king, not a ruthless monster, began to gain ground among scholars. However, the controversy surrounding the princes in the Tower, the disappearance of Edward V and his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, remains the greatest obstacle to a full reconciliation of Richard's legacy. The suspicion that Richard was responsible for the deaths of his nephews has not disappeared with the revision of history, although the lack of concrete evidence keeps this mystery open. This event, more than anything else, continues to mark his image as a monarch whose ruthless actions were motivated by an uncontrollable desire to retain the throne. Even with these shadows cast over his figure, the new approach to Richard III does not ignore the fact that he was a king whose deeds and failings deserve a more nuanced analysis. His tragedy, the loss of the throne and death in battle, makes him a tragic figure whose actions and intentions cannot always be summarized by simple labels of good or evil. He was a monarch who fought passionately for the throne, and at the same time a man marked by his complexity, ambition, and the relentless need to ensure his political survival. As the centuries pass, the figure of Richard III has become more human and less mythological. He is seen not only as a historical monster, but as a victim of the circumstances of his time and the incessant struggle for power. His flaws are acknowledged, but so are his attempts to implement social reforms and ensure the kingdom followed a more organized and just order. Ultimately, Richard III is a figure who represents both absolute power and personal tragedy, a reflection of the fickle nature of medieval politics and the struggle for survival in the struggle for the crown. Now, with the reinterpretation of his reign and death, the image of Richard III continues to evolve. He is no longer just the villain of Shakespeare's plays, or the tyrant condemned by history. He is a monarch whose story, though full of mysteries and ambiguities, remains fascinating and deserves to be considered from different angles. Richard III's legacy is now being viewed more fairly and balancedly, not as that of a monster, but as that of a tragic king, immortalized by his struggle, his mistakes, and his loss. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower remains one of the greatest mysteries in English history, and what happened to Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury will always be one of the most controversial aspects of Richard III's reign. While it has never been proven that Richard was responsible for his nephews' deaths, the suspicion that he had them killed to secure the throne has never completely disappeared. But what really happened to the children? And how has this mystery shaped the perception of Richard III over the centuries? The two princes, Edward V and Richard, disappeared in 1483, shortly after Richard III's accession to the throne. They were taken to the Tower of London, where they were officially to be kept safe until the new king's coronation. However, after a short period, the princes were never seen again. Their absence was immediately noticed, and speculation began to circulate. Several contemporary accounts indicate that Richard, upon his accession to the throne, may have ordered the deaths of the princes to eliminate any threat to his rightful position as king. The narrative that he killed them to secure his power was supported by several contemporary chroniclers, and one of the most persistent accusations was that he did so calculatingly and without remorse. Richard's figure was quickly associated with the image of a man capable of committing political assassination to consolidate his rule. However, this accusation was never proven. The lack of concrete evidence, coupled with the absence of a formal investigation at the time, means that the prince's fate remains shrouded in mystery. Some theorists suggest that the children may have died of natural causes, or even that they were executed, but not on Richard's direct orders. Still others believe there was a conspiracy involving other court figures who acted without Richard's explicit consent. In the years following the prince's disappearance, Richard III was confronted with this enigma, and their disappearance contributed to his growing notoriety as a ruthless monarch. Henry VII, who assumed the throne after defeating Richard, was quick to link the children's disappearance to Richard's tyrannical nature, and this narrative helped cement support for his own claim. However, Richard's death and the rise of the Tudor dynasty did not resolve the mystery, which would continue to be explored by historians, writers, and even the general public. The disappearance of the princes became a central point in the entire historical narrative surrounding Richard III, and his name was largely tarnished by this constant doubt about his character. The disappearance of the princes has in fact become the most enduring shadow on Richard III's legacy, although many attempts to reassess his historical figure have emerged, including more recent archaeological and historical investigations. The mystery of the children in the Tower continues to loom large. To this day, the enigma has never been conclusively solved, and speculation continues. The discovery of Richard III's body in 2012, buried simply in a Leicester parking lot, renewed interest in the king. Analysis of Richard's skeleton revealed a medical condition, scoliosis, that didn't fit the traditional image of a deformed monster. But even with this new perspective on his physical appearance, the disappearance of the princes maintained the association between him and a ruthless monarch. Although Richard's skeleton was found in good condition, there was still no answer to the mystery of the children in the Tower. The debate over the true cause of the princes' deaths and Richard III's responsibility remains a contentious issue. The mystery persists not only as a historical event but also as a metaphor for medieval politics. The disappearance of the princes is often used to illustrate the fear and distrust that permeated the royal court, where the struggle for power and the maintenance of authority often involved matters of survival. This raises the question, to what extent can politics, power games, and the quest for legitimacy corrupt the morality of rulers? Richard III became a monarch of unique complexity. Although his death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, the impact of his life and reign still reverberates throughout history. He was, in many ways, a tragic figure, a man whose reign was violently cut short and who was portrayed as a tyrant by those who defeated him. However, as modern history examines the events and circumstances surrounding his life, it is possible that his figure will be seen in a more balanced light. He was not simply the monster portrayed by Shakespeare or Thomas More, but rather a monarch in a turbulent period, who used whatever means at his disposal to try to maintain control of power. While the question of the fate of the princes in the Tower may never be answered, Richard III's legacy continues to fascinate and generate debate. Was he truly the monster history made him out to be? Or was he the victim of a narrative that condemned him without fair analysis? The mystery of the children in the Tower is only part of his story, a story that continues to intrigue all who venture to understand what happened during the reign of the last Yorkist monarch. Despite his early death and the legacy of controversy that followed, Richard III left a lasting mark on English politics and certain areas of the legal system that, while not always recognized, were important steps in the development of English government. His attempt to govern justly, despite extremely challenging circumstances, was a reflection of his political vision and the measures he took to stabilize a kingdom shaken by the Wars of the Roses and the struggle for power. Although Richard III's reign lasted little more than 2 years, he sought to make significant changes that demonstrated a concern for social and legal issues. One of Richard's greatest legacies was the reform of the legal system, an aspect that, until then, had gone unnoticed by most scholars. One of Richard III's most notable initiatives was the Inheritance Act of 1484, a major reform that sought to ensure better protection for the rights of widows and orphans. During the medieval period, inheritance rights and the treatment of widows were often neglected, and the nobility exploited this to seize land and property. Richard sought to reverse these injustices by creating a more equitable legal system, a rarity for the time. Furthermore, he also implemented measures to improve transparency and impartiality in the judicial system. He sought to ensure that judicial decisions were not based solely on personal favors or the interests of powerful individuals, but that justice was truly accessible to all, regardless of class or status. These reforms, while small-scale, demonstrated a desire to create a more just government that was less susceptible to abuse. Another interesting aspect of his reign was Richard's handling of the appeals system. He made legal cases more organized and accessible to the people, seeking to ensure that complaints against nobles or the crown were heard fairly. This centralization of power in the hands of the king was also seen as an attempt to consolidate royal power and diminish the influence of the nobility, who often used their position to circumvent justice. Richard III faced enormous challenges with the nobility, especially since his accession to the throne was accompanied by great distrust from rival factions. His relationship with the nobility was marked by tension and, at times, betrayal. One example of this was the betrayal of the Duke of Buckingham, one of Richard's closest allies, who rebelled against him in 1483, supporting Henry Tudor's cause. These treacherous actions within his own circle of allies revealed Richard III's fragility as a monarch. To deal with political instability, Richard attempted a more direct and centralizing approach. He took steps to secure the nobles' loyalty through benefits and favors, but he also used royal power to suppress those who opposed his reign. His centralizing policy, however, was not enough to consolidate power in a lasting way, as the nobility resented his rigid control. This absolute control over the nobility may have led to a lack of popular support, crucial in an era when a king's legitimacy depended on the acceptance of both the court and the people. By the time the Battle of Bosworth took place, Richard no longer had the support of the great noble families, and thus his army was at a disadvantage. The battle, which was decided by betrayal and the shifting loyalties of his allies, ultimately sealed his fate. Although his reign was brief and fraught with controversy, the reforms Richard III implemented, especially in the legal sphere, can be seen as a step toward a more modern system. He was, in a sense, a king who sought to use his power to create a more organized and efficient state, where the government was not merely a tool for the nobility, but an entity seeking a more egalitarian system of justice. This legal legacy of Richard's, though often overshadowed by his tyrannical image and his death in battle, was one of the most significant aspects of his reign and a foundation for the future of English politics. Richard, therefore, proves to be a complex figure, not only a monarch who fought for survival on the battlefield, but also a leader who attempted to change politics and the legal system for the better, albeit without the time necessary to see these efforts fully realized. He was someone who, while often seen as a tragic figure, also sought to shape England in a more just way, something that would resonate through the centuries. Richard III also marked a transitional period in English politics. His reign, though short, was the last of the House of York, ending an era of dynastic strife and paving the way for the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. The accession of Henry VII not only sealed the end of the Wars of the Roses, but also laid the foundation for a new policy of centralizing royal power, which would continue throughout Henry VIII's reign and beyond. Richard III's story, therefore, is intertwined with the great changes taking place in England during the late 15th century. His attempt to centralize power and create a more just government, despite challenging circumstances, helped pave the way for future dynasties and their attempts to establish royal authority. Now, as the story of Richard III is re-evaluated and his figure begins to be seen in a new light, it is possible to see that his accession to the throne, his reforms and his attempt to ensure a more just government, are not only a reflection of a medieval monarchy, but also a precursor of the political and legal changes that would occur in the following centuries. Despite his short reign and the controversy that still surrounds his name, Richard III became one of the most enduring figures in English history, immortalized not only in history books but also in literature, theatre, film, and even modern memes. The way he was portrayed over the centuries contributed to strengthening his image as a villain, but also helped keep his name alive in the collective imagination. How is he viewed today, and how has his image been adapted over time? As we've already discussed, one of the most powerful portrayals of Richard III came from the pen of William Shakespeare. The play Richard III, written in the late 16th century, not only cemented Richard as one of the greatest villains in English literature, but also helped create an image of Richard as a man deformed, both physically and morally. On stage, Richard is a fascinating and charismatic yet ruthless character, willing to do anything, even murder relatives to obtain the throne. This depiction of Richard as an evil villain became the dominant image for centuries to come, and many people, to this day, associate Richard III with the image of a cruel tyrant. Shakespeare's work, along with other negative historical accounts, cemented this view, further fueled by popular versions of the story that emerged during the Victorian era and beyond. However, the complexity of Shakespeare's play prevents Richard from being simply categorized as a one-dimensional monster. The play also highlights his political skill, his manipulative charm, and the way he orchestrates his rise to power. The combination of ambition, tragedy, and talent for manipulation made Richard III one of the most intriguing characters in world drama, keeping him relevant in culture to this day. In modern times, Richard III's legacy continues to be revisited, and his portrayal has diversified. Films, books, and television shows have begun to reinterpret Richard in more complex and nuanced ways. In some cases, he is portrayed as a tragic monarch, a victim of the historical circumstances in which he lived, rather than simply as a villain. For example, the recent spate of documentaries and books revisiting historical figures in a more humane light have explored the possibility that Richard III was wronged by a narrative written by his enemies. Contemporary historian and defender of Richard III, Philippa Langley was a key figure in shedding light on the re-examination of his legacy, and her contributions helped revive interest in the monarch in a way that re-examines his life and actions from a new perspective. For Langley and other advocates, the negative image that permeated Richard III was a product of the political dynamics of the time, rather than a fair representation of his actions and intentions. In 2012, the discovery of Richard III's body in Leicester sparked a new wave of interest in the king's story. The fact that he was buried simply and dishonorably in a parking lot reflected how his death was marked by defeat and the contempt of the victors. The discovery of his remains also sparked a series of discussions about how he should be remembered, no longer as a monster of history, but as a human being, with his flaws and qualities, like any other monarch. The reinterpretation of his historical figure also allowed the public to begin questioning the nature of historical narratives that have been constructed over the centuries, and how these narratives are often shaped by political victors. Richard thus became not just a historical figure, but a symbol of the complexity of how history is written and rewritten, and of how popular perceptions can change over time. Richard III's impact extends beyond the pages of history or Shakespeare's plays. In contemporary film and literature, he remains a fascinating figure. Films like Richard III, 1995, starring Ian McKellen and adapted from Shakespeare's work, bring the monarch's image to a modern setting, blending politics, power, and tragedy with a touch of satire. Furthermore, the field of historical fiction also appropriates the figure of Richard III. Authors such as Josephine Tey, in her novel The Daughter of Time, suggest that Richard has been wronged by history. In this novel, the protagonist investigates the king's life and ultimately comes to the conclusion that he was the victim of a conspiracy to demonize him. This new vision of Richard III as a complex man, not necessarily a villain, is one of the many ways he has been reinterpreted over the years. As interest in Richard III grows and new analyses of his life are made, Richard is beginning to be seen in a more just and humane light. Although his history continues to be marked by the controversies surrounding his accession to the throne and the mystery of the children in the tower, he is now also recognized as a monarch who attempted to implement legal reforms and build a more just system of government. This reassessment doesn't mean that Richard III's mistakes are being ignored or minimized, but rather that the narrative about him is shifting, allowing for a deeper understanding of his motivations and actions. At the same time, he remains a figure that inspires fascination and debate, both for historians and the general public. Interest in Richard III gained new momentum in the 21st century, especially after the discovery of his body in 2012. Until then, the monarch had been more of a shadow in English history, his image largely defined by the narratives of his enemies. However, the discovery in Leicester, which revealed Richard III's body buried under a parking lot, marked a turning point. Not only a renewed interest in his story, but also a new perspective on a figure previously seen as a villain. What did this discovery mean for how Richard III is remembered, and for the reinterpretation of his trajectory? In August 2012, a team of archaeologists discovered the remains of Richard III beneath a parking lot in central Leicester, where he had been buried after his death in 1485. The discovery of the skeleton sparked a frenzy of interest and speculation about the monarch and his legacy. Forensic analysis of the body revealed fascinating details, including the presence of scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, which contradicted the popular depiction of Richard as a monstrous figure with a grotesque hump. The new discovery has allowed scholars to question the validity of the depictions of Richard III as a deformed and cruel figure, perpetuated by Shakespeare and other writers of the period. But the discovery went beyond the physical revelation of Richard. It also sparked discussions about how history is written and how certain events can be manipulated or distorted to shape a person's image. Richard III, once considered an unbeatable villain, began to be viewed with more nuance and empathy, with many arguing that he had been wronged by history. The fact that he was buried simply, without much ceremony, symbolized the contempt he received, even after his death. However, with forensic analysis and new historical research, the figure of Richard III began to be reinterpreted in a more complex way. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III, it marked the end of the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that had ravaged England for over 30 years. The conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York had divided the country into violent factions, and Richard III's death was, in many ways, a signal that the long and bloody conflict was coming to an end. Henry VII was not immediately seen as a legitimate monarch. His ascendancy to the throne was fragile. He had a distant lineage to the House of Lancaster, and an even more distant connection to the royal family. His victory at the Battle of Bosworth, therefore, was much more than a simple military victory. He needed to consolidate his authority and ensure the acceptance of the Tudor dynasty, not only by the nobility, but also by the English people. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, was a decisive step in securing this legitimacy. By uniting the houses of Lancaster and York, Henry VII symbolically ended the Wars of the Roses and established a unified government. This marriage marked a milestone for the new Tudor dynasty, which would rule England for generations. Richard III will certainly be remembered as a tragic figure, and this is one of the perspectives that has gained the most traction in modern discussions. As we've seen throughout his history, he wasn't simply the ruthless villain portrayed by Tudor chroniclers and playwrights. His political trajectory and actions can be viewed in a more contextualized way, taking into account the context of his time. Medieval England was marked by constant power struggles, a society where any sign of weakness could be fatal for a monarch, and where the very legitimacy of the throne was constantly under dispute. Richard III faced formidable challenges, from internal strife within the House of York to the skepticism of much of the nobility, who always viewed him with suspicion after the death of his brother, Edward IV. He lived in a time when treachery and intrigue were as common as war itself, and given this, anyone aspiring to the throne had to be willing to take drastic measures. Richard, in his attempt to consolidate his power, was perhaps more a reflection of the political climate of the time than a monster of his own creation. Modern history seems inclined to acknowledge this tragedy, seeing Richard as a monarch who, despite his flaws, was much more than the villain portrayed in literature and by the victors of his battle. His death at the Battle of Bosworth was not only the end of a dynasty, but the closing of an era of incessant power struggles that would define the future of the English monarchy. He was, ultimately, a victim of the very intrigues he sought to control, and this recognition will be part of his lasting legacy. Richard III, therefore, remains one of the most fascinating monarchs in English history. His life and death, his reign and his legacy continue to be fertile ground for study, debate, and popular imagination. As new generations of historians, filmmakers, and writers explore his figure, he will be remembered not only as the last king of the Plantagenet dynasty or the villain of Shakespeare's plays, but also as a tragic figure who perhaps never had the chance to prove his true worth in a world rife with intrigue and betrayal. The future of his memory will depend on how we continue to revisit the past, recognizing not only what was done, but the circumstances under which those actions were taken. The story of Richard III will always be a reminder of how power and ambition often define the fate of a kingdom, but also of a man. And now we've reached the end of our journey behind the king, who for centuries was seen as a villain, but whose story is far from simple. What do you think of Richard III's legacy? How do you think he will be remembered by generations to come? Leave your comment below, like the video, and share it with friends to continue exploring the fascinating stories of royalty and mystery. that shaped the world we know. Don't forget to subscribe for more historical and intriguing content.